Assalamualaikum dan hai, nama saya Nur Aqilla Shazana binti nombor matrik 265456. Saya akan menerangkan tentang poin yang pertama, iaitu Physical and Human Resource Endowment. Di dalam poin ini menyatakan bahawa negara-negara yang sedang membangun menghadapi masalah untuk mendapatkan sumber alam berbanding dengan negara-negara yang telah maju, yang telah mendapatkan sumber alam sendiri seperti minyak, bahan mineral dan bahan mentah yang lain. Negara-negara Asia adalah negara-negara yang sedang membangun, iaitu ia meliputi 1/2 daripada penduduk dunia, dan ia juga lebih banyak didapati di kawasan Afrika. Namun terdapat ahli arkeologi menyatakan bahawa terdapat banyak lagi sumber asli ataupun sumber alam yang belum diterokai kerana mempunyai masalah dalam mendapatkan modal, iaitu pelaburan. Hal ini biasanya diterokai oleh orang-orang barat yang mencukupi modal untuk mendapatkan bahan-bahan tersebut. Ia telah dibuktikan oleh masyarakat ataupun negara China sendiri yang menyatakan bahawa mereka perlu mengumpulkan lebih banyak duit ataupun modal untuk mendapatkan sesuatu sumber. Selain itu, hasil tenaga kerja dan kemahiran pekerja ataupun manusia sendiri merupakan salah satu sumber asli yang boleh meningkatkan pelaburan ekonomi negara tersebut. Sebagai contoh, sebelum kemerdekaan, negara kita sendiri telah pun menggunakan kemahiran tenaga kerja kita sendiri, namun bermodalkan negara-negara barat. Ia bermaksud negara barat itu sendiri seperti British telah mengeluarkan modal dan pekerja-pekerjanya adalah di kalangan kita sendiri. Okey, poin yang kedua adalah per capita income and level of GDP. Okey, pendapatan negara adalah sangat penting. Pendapatan negara yang sedang membangun adalah lebih rendah daripada pendapatan negara-negara yang maju. Hal ini menyebabkan pendapatan penduduk negara tersebut lebih rendah daripada pendapatan negara itu. Hampir 40% pendapatan bagi penduduk negara yang sedang membangun telah membelanjakan hasil pendapatannya seminimum yang mungkin. Dan selain itu juga, negara yang telah membangun yang pada kini digelar sebagai negara maju seperti US, United States, telah menggunakan hasil daripada kemajuan mereka dengan mengurangkan jurang pendapatan penduduk mereka sendiri untuk membantu ekonomi mereka sendiri. Poin yang seterusnya adalah climate differences. Okey, di dalam poin ini telah menerangkan hampir semua negara-negara yang sedang membangun terletak di zon iklim subtropika ataupun tropika. Telah dikaji bahawa negara-negara maju terletak di zon yang sederhana. Penjajah telah menyatakan bahawa ekstraktif adalah perlu. Ia bermaksud mereka tidak akan membantu mana-mana pihak yang tidak bersesuaian dengan mana-mana persekitaran setempatnya. Dan yang lebih teruk adalah kawasan yang beriklim teruk, bahawa mereka akan mengalami impak yang negatif di kawasan mereka sendiri, seperti kerosakan dalam kehidupan haiwan mereka, kehidupan tumbuhan, malah individu yang berada di tempat tersebut. Sebagai contoh, jika individu itu berada di kawasan beriklim panas, maka ia akan menjejaskan tahap kesihatannya dan membuatkan ia berasa cepat letih untuk melakukan pekerjaan. Hal ini akan menyebabkan prestasi ekonomi mereka juga akan terganggu. Namun terdapat juga beberapa penyakit yang dapat dibantu, seperti negara yang mempunyai banyak kes-kes malaria, ia telah dibantu dengan memberikan vaksin terhadap penyakit tersebut.
Hello everyone, my name is Lim Su Feng and my metric number is 261699. Now I will continue with the point population size, distribution and growth. This also constitutes another important difference between developed and developing countries. Before and during their early growth years, Western nations experienced a very slow rise in population growth. As industrialization proceeded, Population growth rates increased primarily as a result of falling death rates, but also because of slowly rising birth rates. However, at no time did European and North American countries have natural population growth rates in excess of 2% per annum, and they generally average much less. By contrast, the populations of many developing countries have been increasing at annual rates in excess of 2.5% in recent decades, and some are still rising that fast today. Moreover, the concentration of these large and growing populations in a few areas means that many developing countries have considerably higher person-to-land ratios than the European countries did in their early growth years. In fact, many observers doubt whether the Industrial Revolution and the high long-term growth rates of contemporarily developed countries could have been achieved or proceeded so fast and with so few setbacks and disturbances, especially for the very poor, had their populations been expanding so rapidly. Moving on to the point, the historical role of international migration. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, a major outlet for rural populations was international migration, which was both widespread and large-scale. More than 60 million people migrated to the Americas between 1850 and 1914, a time when world population averaged less than a quarter of its current levels. In countries such as Italy, Germany, and Ireland, periods of famine or pressure on the land often combined with limited economic opportunities in urban industry to push unskilled rural workers toward the labor-scarce nation of North America and Australia. There is far less scope for reducing the pressures of growing populations in developing countries today through massive international emigration, largely due to the very restrictive nature of immigration laws in modern developed countries. Over 50 million people from the developing world have managed to migrate to the developed world since 1960. The pace of migration from developing to developed countries, particularly to the United States, Canada, and Australia, has picked up since the mid-1980s to between 2 and 3 million people per year. And the numbers of undocumented or illegal migrants have increased dramatically since 1980. Some people in recipient industrialized nations feel that these migrants are taking jobs away from poor, unskilled citizen workers. Moreover, illegal migrants and their families are often believed to be taking unfair advantage of free local health, educational, and social services, causing upward pressure on local taxes to support these services, despite emerging evidence that legalizing immigration actually provides a net positive effect on reducing deficit as well as to overall economic activity. As a result, major debates are now underway in both the United States and Europe regarding the treatment of illegal migrants. Many citizens want severe restriction on the number of immigrants that are permitted to enter or reside in developed countries. A potential benefit is that the mere possibility of skilled immigration might encourage many more workers to acquire information technology or other skills than are ultimately able to leave, leading to a net increase in labor force skills. At least in theory, the result could actually be a brain gain. The fundamental point remains, however, that the possibility of international migration of unskilled workers on a scale proportional to that of the 19th and early 20th centuries no longer exists to provide an equivalent safety valve for the unskilled contemporary populations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. That's all for me. Thank you.
Hello guys, I am Tey Kwee Ting, and I would like to continue the point of how low-income countries today differ from developed countries, which is the growth stimulus of international trade, basic scientific and technological research and development capabilities. And last is about efficacy of domestic institutions, the growth stimulus of international trade. There are several main points of the classical theory of international trade. Alright, so what is trade? Trade is an important stimulator of economic growth. It enlarges country consumption capacities and increase the world output. Besides that, trades help countries to achieve development by promoting and rewarding those sectors of the economy where individual countries have a comparative advantage, whether in terms of labor efficiency or factor endowment. And rapidly expanding export market provided an additional stimulus to growing up the local demand that led to the establishment of large-scale manufacturing industry. So, for the developed countries were able to participate in dynamic growth of international exchange on the basis of free trade, free capital movement, and the unfettered international migration of unskilled surplus labor. While the developing countries, especially non-oil exporting countries, were unable to generate the rapid economic growth on the basis of world trade. Their export amount have to grow faster just to earn the same amount of foreign currency. The next point is about basic scientific and technological research and development capabilities. Better application of technologies of broad international interest can improve most of the aspects of social and economy. As we can see, science and technological is concentrated in the rich nation, while the low-income developing nation do not have the financial resource on the basic scientific and technological to undertake the kind of research and development in their economy long-term interests. And last is about efficacy of domestic institutions. The developed countries enjoy the stronger political stability and more flexible social institutions with broader access to mobility. Moreover, they have economic rules that provide broad access to opportunity for individuals with entrepreneurial drive. In contrast, the developing countries are high in inequality and poor institution facilitating extraction that's established by colonial power, especially in Africa. The national boundaries before, and for example in Africa, more controlled by colonial power, and it is dangerous of becoming so, and the nation boundaries called as failed state, because the nation still in the situation of post-colonial period.
Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Shahriel bin Sayuti. My metric number is 261733. Okay, we go through for my part. My part is our living standards of developing and developed nations convergence. Okay, divergence. Divergence is a tendency for per capita income or output to grow faster in higher income countries than in lower income countries, so that the income get widened across countries over time, as was seen in the 2 centuries after industrialization began. Okay, for the convergence is the tendency for per capita income or output to grow faster in lower income countries than in higher income countries, so that lower income countries are catching up over time. When countries are hypothesis to converge, not in all cases, but other things being equal. Okay, for this part, we have 2 reasons to expect that developing countries would. Okay, if the growth experience of developing and developed countries was similar, there are 2 important reasons to expect the developing countries would be catching up by growing faster on average than developed countries. The first reason is technology transfer. Okay, technology transfer. To this, developing countries do not have to reinvent the wheel. For example, they do not have to use vacuum tubes before they can use semiconductors. Even if royalties must be paid, it is cheaper to replace technologies than to undertake original R&D, partly because one does not have to pay for mistake and dead ends along the way. Okay, as a result, they should be able to grow much faster than today's developed countries are growing now or were able to grow in the past when they had to invent the technology as they went alone and proceed step by step through the historical stages of innovations. Okay, the second reason is factor accumulations. Okay, today's developed countries have higher level of physical and human capital. In a production function analysis, this would explain their higher levels of output per person. But in traditional neoclassical analysis, the marginal product of capital and the profitability of investment would be lower in developed countries where capital intensity is higher, provided that the law of diminishing returns apply. That is, the impact of additional income on output would be expected to be smaller in a developed country that already had a lot of capital in relation to the size of its workforce than in developing countries where capital was scarce. As a result, we would expect higher investment rates in developing countries at the through domestic sources or through attracting foreign investment. With higher investment rate, capital would grow more quickly in developing countries until approximately equal levels of capital and other things being equal output per worker were achieved. Okay, we go through for relative country convergence. Okay, the most widely used approach is simply to examine whether poor countries are growing faster than richest countries. As long as this is happening, poor countries would be on the path of eventually catch up to the income levels of rich countries. In the meantime, the relative gap in incomes would be shrinking as the income of richest countries would become a smaller multiple of income of poor countries. Okay, income of poor countries would become an increasing largest fraction of income of rich countries. This can be seen on a country by country basis. Although China average income was just 3% that of the United States in 1980. It was estimated to have reached 14% of US income by 2007. But in the same period, the income of the DRC fell from about 5% of US levels to just 1%. But globally, evidence for relative convergence is weak, even for the most recent descendants. Okay, I think that's all for my part, and we go through for the next presenter. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum Major and good day all. My name is Norhana binti Muhamad Nisfu, matrix number 263467. I'm going to continue with my point, which is absolute country convergence. I'll start with an example. In the 1990 to 2003 period, income in high-income OECD countries grew by 24%, Meanwhile, with the recent rapid growth in China and South Asia, their income grew higher than the OECD, which was 196% and 56% respectively. However, due to relatively low starting income levels, their income gains were still smaller in absolute amounts than in the OECD, as shown right here. This concludes that even if a developing country's average income becomes a greater fraction of the average income of developed countries, the gap in income will continue to widen for some time until they eventually begin to shrink. Absolute convergence has been used to mean convergence to the same income level unconditional on structural characteristics. A process of absolute country convergence is a stronger standard than a process of relative country convergence, which appears only with a lag after. The next point is population-weighted relative country convergence. The high growth rate in China and India is particularly important because more than 1/3 of the world's people live in these two countries. This approach frames the question to weigh the importance of a country's per capita income growth rate proportionately to the size of its population. If current trends continue, then China, India, and Brazil will account for nearly 40% of global output by 2050, compared with about 10% in 1950. Although it is true that conditions have remained stagnant or even worsened in many of the least developed countries, with a population-weighted approach due to their smaller population sizes, this divergence effect is more than offset by development in countries with large populations. The population growth rates of the 49 least developed and other low-income countries, for example, are significantly higher than those of the middle and upper-income countries, so their population weight increases over time. Fourth point is world as one country convergence. An alternative approach to the study of convergence is to think of the world as if it were one country. In the first such study, Branko-Milanovic stitched together household data sets from around the world and concluded that global inequality rose significantly in the period of 1988 to 1993. The most important difference from population-weighted country convergence is that a world as one country convergence study can take into account changes in inequality within countries as well as between them. In particular, the widening gulf between incomes in rural and urban China had a major effect on the finding of global divergence using this method. But most researchers and policymakers frame development as a process that occurs on the national level, something rather different from global inequality, and country convergence studies remain the standard. The last point is sectoral convergence. Despite evidence that economies are not converging unconditionally, there can be cross-national convergence of economic sectors, which in turn may signal the potential for future convergence. Danny Roderick found evidence that there has been convergence in manufacturing, within implications that the failure to find overall convergence across countries is due to the small share and slow growth of manufacturing employment in low-income countries. That's the end. That is all from us, Blue Origin. Thank you.